Hi everyone, I'm Suma, and this is Igor Kufayev. He's a leading expert in the field of human potential and personal transformation. He's also a professional artist and founder of Flowing Wakefulness organization. Speaking from direct realization of oneness, he inspires all people to recognize the fullest potential present in human birth. Hi, Igor.
Hi, Suma.
I'm really thankful for this opportunity. It's very rare to find someone like you who has, I've seen that you have covered a wide spectrum about these subjects of self-realization and awakening. And it's rare to find that, so thank you.
No, it's great. I'm very looking forward to our talk and see what comes out of it.
I think it would be nice to first clear off some of the criticism of old traditional teachings, because I've noticed that in non-dual circles, usually if someone even mentions that they are a spiritual teacher, they immediately get discredited, that there's nothing to teach about this, like it's very simple and obvious, and teachings keep up the ego locked in to practices. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, in order for us to really kind of address this paradox, because obviously there is this paradox in terms of how can there be any teaching if all there is this reality of oneness, if we are to speak from non-dual traditions, so-called Advaitic traditions. So at the face value, these statements, these propositions, these kind of dismissals are legitimate, or they have legitimate base behind them. But the problem comes when we approach this from the perspective which, funny enough, is still deeply personal and pertinent to whatever conditioning here is that consciousness, so to speak, undergoes in this, what we call human phase, this embodiment. Now, traditionally speaking, this highest philosophical truth was reserved for those who have done, let's say, all there is to do in terms of preparation. In other words, the interesting phenomena of the popularity of Neo-Advaita, non-duality, and all these traditions in the West, that they have took these statements, and they took these statements at the face value, presuming that they are applicable to every human being, simply because these statements pronounce the ultimate truth. And although they are pronouncing the ultimate truth, they are not applicable simply because it's not human experience. It's not everyone's experience. So in other words, if we are to reiterate this, these highest, loftiest statements of, let's say, non-dual teachings in Vedantic traditions, going all the way to someone who is considered to be the greatest exponent of that tradition, the 8th century Indian sage Adi Shankara, or else known as Shankaracharya, then we would have to really look into this sincerely. And what we will find is that traditional scriptural references of the Advaita Vedanta were reserved for those who have already enough experience on their hand, and all they need is this confirmation that this is indeed what they experience is validated by timeless tradition. And this beautiful relationship between what is being experienced, then being in turn validated through scriptural references, gives these experiences legitimacy, whilst also enlivening that tradition, because these statements, if they are only coming from the era gone past and not being lived by earthlings, human beings, in any of the phases throughout the history of time, then there is no value in them. And yet, this precise relationship has been completely dismissed, or widely dismissed, in Neo-Advaita and non-dualist circles, starting from the rise of that as a global movement, circa, let's say, maybe mid-90s. Maybe it started somewhere slightly earlier, but by mid-90s there were first so-called homegrown teachers out there. We can begin to name them. We can name them on one or two hands, and we can, these were amazing, wonderful, very courageous, very bold teachers, men and women, came up and they began to share this wisdom. By, let's say, sometimes 2010, roughly, what began to happen is that these non-dual circles, this Neo-Advaita, took this whole spiritual scene by storm to such degree that a lot of these traditional perspectives were so widely dismissed, in some cases ridiculed, in some cases completely considered almost superstitious and kind of like, belonging to the era gone by, that the situation became almost comical, because people who have received these messages, people who repeatedly in fact received these messages, because satsang movement as a movement was precisely that. You go, you spend time in the company of so-and-so, and you repeatedly hear this kind of discourses, mostly in the form of questions and answers, where the question usually will be turned back into the questioner, who is behind the question. And so what actually happened is that the whole non-duality Neo-Advaita movement came squarely into a dead end of its crisis, because it did not deliver. What do I mean by that? It's not deliver. Obviously, people always wake up to the greater reality of who they are, in every tradition. Absolutely every tradition. That's the way of life. But the premises of this Neo-Advaita and non-duality were almost on par with either new religion or new science. In fact, very often they kind of like the absolutism of these statements, the absolutism of these approaches was very much kind of almost sounded as the absolutist approaches of the fanatics of given religion, when they try to declare that their truth is the ultimate one and everything else is to be dismissed because it's simply not true. So, in reality though, how many people actually realized that what is to realize? How many people sincerely, who have attended these satsangs for years, actually began to live at that level of being which is promised by these teachings? So it's interesting that behind the scenes, when peers in the field, when we speak about this, even those teachers who kind of could be considered pioneers of this movement, they themselves, above all else, realized that it did not work. And you can see, again, key figures began to come up with a kind of body of teaching. So if at the beginning it was there's nothing to teach, there's no one at home, there's nothing to do because everything is already as it is, it kind of didn't work anymore. And these teachers began to develop the body of work, including methodologies to take the followers and seekers somewhere where there can be a actual shift in consciousness, shift in awareness. So this is maybe a kind of like to give us the perspective why these slogans, these premises and these promises of Neo-Advaita and non-dualism kind of, if I may say, fell on its face because it simply discarded the fact that that kind of residue in the human being, in the nervous system, is not something that one can simply transcend by mere analytical, intellectual insight into the nature of ultimate reality. And even if the flicker of, oh yeah, I kind of, yes, I'm kind of getting this, or wow, or just falling into silence, or just suddenly kind of feeling that maybe that's what it is, right? That in itself is nothing, traditionally speaking, to write home about. Like if we are to borrow sayings of some of the perspective that withstood the test of time, even a dozen of Satoris, speaking that Zen terms, right, that illumination, is nothing unless there is this complete and utter realignment takes place. And these Satoris, these insights, these profound kind of bulbs lit somewhere, lighting all this, what is there to be lit, gives us this a confirmation that we may be on the right path. But to presume that the message that there is nothing to do simply because already everything as it is a kind of poor man's supper, a naked or like a new dress of a king, if you will, which at best confuses a sincere seeker after truth. At worst, it robs him or her of time that can be spent in pursuing this in a more active way, because indeed it can be pursued in a more active and, dare I say, productive, pragmatically speaking, more productive way, because nervous system cannot be outsmarted here just by thinking that certain mental intellectual concepts may ring true, may bring a lot of psychological relief temporarily, but this does not amount for freeing the nervous system from all these impositions, right? That what this real job is all about, and the kind of underlying theme of our conversation today hopefully will shed light on that.
I think one advantage about that type of approach is that it can really destroy the seeker because it gives nothing to hold on to. So in a way that, in some cases, that may be effective, because sometimes in the traditional approach, it seems like a person may get lost in like all these experiences and more and more practices. So that's one thing I think that may be like, at least for that first shift of self-realization, in the modern approach may be more effective. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, of course, like, we all are different. There are some extraordinary beings who can grasp or access that ultimate kind of, flavor of what this is really about. maybe there are already some kind of preliminary build-up of sorts, and that could be anything. That could be it could be tragedy experienced in life. It could be on the account of just that brilliance, brilliance in that amount of intuitive insight. Because really, intuition plays tremendous role here. We can speak more about this if you want to know that the intuition, in fact, if we to refer to the Brahma Sutras, which are considered to be one of the most authoritative texts on Advaita Vedanta, which have been commented by great beings. We even have comments by Adi Shankara, the aforementioned one. We have comments by great Vyasa, Veda Vyasa, potentially it could be the one who compiled the Vedas themselves. So this Brahma Sutras stands colossal as this supreme text on Advaita Vedanta within the scope of Indian tradition. And there is this verse in the Brahma Sutras, there is this sutra which speaks about Brahman is first cognized by intellect. What it means by, of course, Indian philosophy deals with more specific terms. So there is the term, let's say, mind and intellect used interchangeably in Western culture, certainly in English language, as far as I know. In Sanskrit, however, there is a specific term for the mind, which is manas, and specific term for the intellect, which is buddhi. And buddhi is considered to be superior in terms of its, or sattva, superior in terms of sattva. So, in fact, the whole conglomerate, traditionally speaking, is that it is the mixture of buddhi with the sense of self, represented by ahamkara, right, that creates manas. In other words, our mind is already our mind, my mind, your mind, right? So-and-so's mind. Whereas intellect has this purity. So the Brahma Sutras say that the Brahman is cognized first by intellect. So that first flash, that first insight comes purely as that spontaneous, intuitive access to what we are and who we are. And of course, this could happen to anyone at any time. Tradition, East and West, full of these accounts and examples how a poet, a painter, a scientist, a layman, a woman have experienced this. In the traditions where there's a wealth of information, how this can be interpreted, maybe it was easier. In those where access was not, was given to that rise of the mystic verse, mystic interpretation. But these insights, of course, are there. So therefore we cannot say that, no, this is not true, that you have to do this and this and that in order to become who you are. No, of course it is given, otherwise we will limit consciousness or awareness. And awareness is non-local, we cannot do that. And yet, with all that being said, and going back to the Brahma Sutras, no spiritual teacher of merit will ever give any, layman a Brahma Sutras to do their work. It's just a no-no. It almost will be like a cherry on a cake of final realization. First there will be initiation. First there will be introducing someone into what is traditionally spoken of as the path. So the grinding can begin. Something can begin to churn itself. So the subject-object relationship can have the chance to get more and more refined. Because these concepts, though immediate and almost accessible, they are extremely subtle. Extremely subtle. And even though mind can momentarily have that insight, that insight doesn't amount for anything because it subsides and fizzles into a thin air almost as soon as it rises. So therefore this, even neurophysiology need to be brought to a state where that can be, if you will, secured, so that rising knowledge which arises spontaneously on its own can be embodied and not at the mercy of suddenly kind of happy-go-lucky, got it today, lost it tomorrow. So therefore, these Brahma Sutras, yes, the loftiest teachings, will be given as that, okay, I have these experiences, I have that experience, I'm kind of, I don't know, I wonder, and the teacher then, okay, yes, I hear you, here is the Brahma Sutras. And then you go, wow, and it's like, wow, yes. And then that symbiotic relationship between what is being accessed directly already, touched, experienced, but had no, perhaps, any solid ground beneath this. These realizations could even be dismissed as speculative. Now they gain a proper foundation through being validated by these expositions, highly philosophical, highly esoteric expositions in the Brahma Sutras or any of the Advaitic scriptures. Speaking of that. So you see, so that anyone who I spoke to about this over years, anyone who is in this business of either sharing this wisdom, imparting, teaching, one way or the other, they have all agreed that it's fantastic that this non-duality was a great experiment. It was very sweet, very noble. I have said somewhere some years ago that at some point I even thought that this was a great attempt to overcome centuries of religious kind of indoctrination, almost kind of like an attempt to overcome that religious baggage, psychologically speaking, that desire for purification of that access, you see. Now I tend to think also that there is another underbelly to the popularity of the non-duality and Neo-Advaita, and that is because this simply serves very much to the culture which glorifies individuality. So it's a very much on par with the overall development of our culture at the present. This teaching almost came as that final answer. Okay, so what you want, whatever you want, right? Everything here at the disposal of your desires. Everything here. The whole culture of so-called democracy, the whole structure of the capitalism here is at the service of satisfying our needs. So here comes, in addition, okay, you want enlightenment, here we go. There's a quick way to get enlightened. And non-duality provided that quick so-called access, an attempt to commoditize that what, frankly speaking, has nothing to do with just hearing about it. It needs to become a lived truth. It needs to be embodied fully.
I also wanted to give a little bit of context for viewers or listeners who are new. And different speakers have different way of describing self-realization. How would you describe what is self-realization?
Well, self-realization. Again, you see that since as a teacher I consciously work with and utilize existing modules, formats of some traditional approaches. For example, it's not a secret, and you know that I teach under the umbrella of Tantra, and more specifically in Kashmir Shaiva Tantras, the so-called Trika Shaivism. With that said, I never hesitate to bring, if need be, examples from Sufi traditions. This another very interesting, very beautiful monistic tradition. And when you work with these traditional methodologies, of course, the term self-realization can be spoken with respect of how it is being defined and understood in the given tradition. Because the beauty of the tradition is that those who come as custodians, those who come as living embodiments of this or that tradition, they don't discard this wealth of knowledge, even in terms of the way it is being given to a language. They build up on that. At some point, of course, the carpet would be pulled beneath one's feet, and that happens also very often as part of that tradition anyway. So self-realization is nothing other than realization of one's essential nature, of who one is. So in other words, self-realization is a deeply intimate affair. From the point of view of Kashmir Shaivism, for example, just as an example, self-realization spoken very often in terms of that universal egoity. Realization that all there is that reality of Shiva, and Shiva here represents awareness, not some external awareness, not some greater awareness, but awareness of one's own self, dearer than the dearest, nearer than the nearest. So self-realization, speaking from these, let's say, Vedic tantric traditions, it's realizations of one's essence, of who one is. And of course from here the work begins, because this may be perplexing. So what is there to realize? If I am who I am, does that suffice? Would that suffice? And then we begin to enter these deep waters of existentialism. Deep waters, I'm saying deep waters because this is where contemporary psychology has reinvented itself, precisely because it drew richly from the wealth of knowledge that came with predecessors. Namely, without Carl Jung, we could argue psychology in the West today would be completely different. We don't even know, we can't even imagine what psychology will be today without his input at such an early stage, still when he was contemporary of Sigmund Freud. But there is a vast difference between them, because Jung drew richly from the esoteric traditions of Taoism, Tantra, from traditions of alchemists in the West. You see? So I'm not sure if I'm departing too much from what you have asked, but it just takes me there, simply because speaking about self-realization, one sooner or later begins to realize that even beneath this veneer of identity with the body-mind conglomerate, it's not enough to simply declare, well, I'm not this senses, therefore I'm not this body, right, with the organs of cognition, because that's what body is. I'm not this mind, right, that thinks these thoughts, I'm not even this sort of subtle emotional body where the feelings come and rise, because I know this comes and goes. I have direct experiences on a daily basis. And this so-called reducing it, right, like deducting this neti-neti approach, doesn't do that psychological work for you. Just by admitting that you are not and not of that, and trying to trace it all the way back to what you are, like again, these Vedic stories are, right? That who am I? The son comes to the father and asks, and wants to know this, and sends him one day around, go and ask this question, seek answers. And the boy goes and, he experiences phenomenal reality, comes back, well, I'm certainly not this, because I've just, I looked into it carefully, and I can see that that's not who I am. Okay, keep going. He goes out again, and he wanders around, have this encounter, that encounter, comes back, well, I know I'm not that, because I have the confirmation of this, because this is not still who I am. So you see this kind of almost accessible today at the tip of the fingers in terms of availability. This profound wisdom, profound knowledge doesn't removes the need for profound work which this requires. So sooner or later, sincere seekers of truth, even finders, because we can speak about seekers versus finders, realize that one can sit only that long on the laurels of, oh yeah, there's nothing to seek because already everything is that. So therefore seeking is an oxymoron, therefore seeking in itself is kind of postponing it. And given you are belonging to that discourse, that recourse that comes from, let's say, someone like Punjaji, right? Then very quickly this will become a comfortable place to settle. But people forget that Punjaji was profoundly awakened being. He went through a whole process himself. He went through the whole process, traditionally speaking. He never spoke about to the Westerners because he saw who flocked to him. He was not a fool, he was very smart. He saw people who came, sat in front of him. Okay, to some he gave some really good Shakti path. Others simply ended up with some intellectual configuration and they were happy with that and they thought, well, that's all there is. I'm just saying, hopefully the viewers of your channel will relate to these analogies given here, because it's not just Papaji or Punjaji. There are many other teachers who are considered by the that kind of Neo-Advaita non-duality scene to trace the origin. And one way or the other, it's it kind of all culminates with Ramana Maharshi, maybe a couple of other names, but it's mostly with Ramana Maharshi or to Ramana Maharshi that everyone likes to trace their lineage or origin or ultimate ways of speaking about this. You see?
Yeah, in some cases, it seems like that realization has happened kind of through the lens of mind. The mind is still active, although the realization has happened. Can you talk about the process of the unfoldment after the self-realization, and also like some of the perception refinements as well as dissolution of mind, how that process looks like?
Again, although it's very unique from person to person, and everyone will experience this in accord with latent samskaras, the so-called impositions, these latent samskaras that form a kind of a subtle field, layered, like imagine it like a layered, like a many layered tiramisu, whatever cake, of these samskaric tendencies that in the first place give us that sense of a living individual. This is again speaking chiefly from acknowledged perspectives, and even if we are to go to this very radical teachers like the aforementioned Ramana Maharshi, then though he spoke about very often, who was known for speaking very direct, unapologetic kind of sayings, and his responses were very often, kind of cut through the soul, dismissing very often the personal provenance of the question, let alone questioner, so as to turn the question back to the questioner, to where the question rises from. Even Ramana Maharshi did not dismiss or abandon or relaxed more traditional approaches in terms of when he spoke about it, what is it all, and how it, why this calamity, why, if everything is, if one is Brahman, right, that Sanskrit term, the term that Advaita Vedanta uses for the absolute reality, for the ultimate utmost reality of oneness, that Brahman, if everything is Brahman, if Atman is Brahman, if this Atma, this what experiences itself as individual soul, is nothing other than absolute reality, so where does this calamity come from? Why that there is the sense of separation? Of course, his followers and students, disciples, were pressing these questions, and he repeatedly spoke about it. What amazes me, though, is that those who profess, and now I'll just kind of speak kind of from a very direct experience with coming across these people, and those people who very often dismiss or dismissive of spiritual methodologies, of the needs for introspection, meditative practices, ethics, and so forth, like all that what comprises healthy, well-built, well-balanced spiritual work, sadhana, in other words. These people use Ramana Maharshi's saying as poker card, but when you dig deeper, when you kind of, go, they have very skin-deep knowledge of Ramana Maharshi's teaching. Very often, very superficial understanding of Ramana's teachings. So it's very helpful when, if someone wants to find out exactly what happens and why and how, we go and examine what the apostle, the so-called apostle of the Neo-Advaita, because that's how Ramana Maharshi is often referred to, the greatest of all the apostles of Neo-Advaita. Ramana Maharshi is being held. What does he has to say about this or that? What does he has to say about sadhana? What does he has to say about direct path? What does he has to say about Kundalini and the place of Shakti? What does he has to say about sankalpas? What does he has to say about vikalpas and samskaras? All this what comprises the actual teaching. But hearing few discourses here that came again through this teacher or through that teacher, and then it came through its Western counterpart, through that Western teacher who further somehow, in my view, in my opinion, distorts that teaching, or giving it a personalized understanding, which if it berefts the original source from the complexity and richness, then one will end up with partial teaching. And partial teaching is partial truth. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but this would often kind of, not anymore maybe so much, but this used to kind of puzzle me in the past. How can that be? So if someone chooses their spiritual idols, if someone chooses the spiritual kind of ultimate example, why don't you go and find it for yourself? What is actually what? So, see?
What's the role of Kundalini in self-realization?
It's about everything. It's like whenever we say what's the role of Kundalini, Maybe first we need to kind of give the term a slight definition for those who, well, certainly most of the people who watch your channel, those who will come across of this kind of interview, if they went that far, they must have heard the term Kundalini. You know, it's became a household item, or rather the term that enjoys wide recognition and widely known. And yet, with that being said, the term Kundalini still remains to be the most mysterious, in a sense that there is a lot of misperception and misconception surrounding what that really stands for and what that represents. So, and it's neatly connected to what we spoke earlier, because in the modern spirituality, in particular, that bias on what Kundalini is and what it is not, what its place, purpose, role, and limitation is all too apparent. But that actually comes from, or rather has the historical counterpart. So in that respect, it's not just something that has been mistaken or misunderstood by us modern beings. This kind of, there is a tradition in itself almost of how to view Kundalini, what is Kundalini. And we would need to first define and very clearly, very attentively go and see what is the term stands for, who uses this term, why this term is being used at all, and why in some cases this term was abandoned, or rather relaxed, and went underground as a term, not as a power, because we will speak about it, I hope, later on, what actually Kundalini here really represents, but still about the etymology of the term. So again, if we are to borrow, or if we are to go to the culture where the term itself comes from, right? If we are to go to the Indian civilization, if we are to go to Hinduism, the very term Kundalini is inseparable from Vedic culture. And references to Kundalini were made as far back as the early Upanishads. With that being said, the term Kundalini did not figure in the most ancient books, such as, let's say, the epic Rig Veda. And the scholars argue that the term at that time used by ancient sages, compilers of the Rig Veda, was Vak, that Sanskrit term. And there are plenty of references to that term Vak in the Rig Vedas. That term Vak is analogous, or very, very similar to the English, or rather Latin, logos, ancient Greek Latin, logos. That biblical, in the beginning there was a word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. It's in the same way, so there's that kind of like tracing it to the ultimate prior to prior. The term Kundalini reappeared, or rather appeared later on, and then could be found used throughout entire scriptural output in variety of ways, and this is where the diversions began to take place. But the earliest references, Kundalini was used, or rather when we speak to, or when we borrow these earliest references, the term Kundalini was used interchangeably with Brahman. And this would be one, that kind of Neo-Advaitin today should go and read papers of the collections of Ramana Maharshi saying, when responding to one of the questions which is a canonical account. It's very well known to scholars and very well known to real enthusiasts of Ramana Maharshi's teaching, is when he was asked, Bhagwan, what is Kundalini and what's its purpose, And his response was very straightforward and kind of like put all the speculations aside. He said, Kundalini is nothing other than the self. It's Shakti. It's just, sometimes we say Brahman, but at other times we refer to it as Shakti. At other times we say it as Kundalini, the self, Atma. So the so-called proponent of Atma Vikara made it very clear that Kundalini here is nothing other than absolute. And furthermore, he gave this analogy. He said, it's just the yogin, the yogi, pursues the path of activation of that force through these special methods, mainly known through Hatha Yoga, where the body is held in such way, in this posture, with the use of pranayama, with the use of bodily locks known as bandhas, one way or the other, controlling the life force, yogi would awaken that Kundalini. With the Jnani, Ramana Maharshi continued, one would be given to the process of self-inquiry, which sooner or later will lead to the awakening of the life force, and in both cases, it will enter the Sushumna, and upon entering the Sushumna, Kundalini will complete the process. Period. No room for speculation left. But how many people bothered to look into this and learn this? I've heard people who say that Ramana Maharshi undermined and dismissed Kundalini. Well, that is a lie. That is a kind of like a fake news. You see, it's a kind of, a real disease of our time, because nobody really wants to go to the source and really learn, because nobody has the time. And because of that, there is this propensity to take at the face value the superficial notions, these superficial sayings, which, interestingly enough, always somehow self-serving. In this case, it serves simply this inability or unwillingness to work on one's tendencies, inability to apply a required effort, of which Ramana Maharshi spoke aplenty as well. So now, going back to the question you've posed, what is Kundalini and what is its role in the process of spiritual realization? We could kind of make this as an entrance, because it's a vast topic, vast theme, that Kundalini is that what holds everything together. Kundalini is all there is. It's the underlying reality of our consciousness, that what connects everything. And yet, the reason why there are these possibilities when people begin to split hairs is because it is the way the term being used and utilized specifically in a certain tradition with regard to a certain process or even a condition versus what it stands philosophically. You see? So as Ramana Maharshi's response and earlier iterations in terms of how the ancient rishis use that term, that it's nothing other than the self, versus the process. And this is where the differences began to enter and rule. So at some point, certain traditions began to look so different in their approaches. So the term Kundalini gained a kind of undesirable association. So when you say Kundalini, oh, that's that camp, you see? I'm coming completely from a different camp. In my camp, we've got nothing to do with Kundalini. If I belong to the camp of non-duality, then Kundalini, it's your Indian thing, I'm not interested, okay? So don't even get me involved. And yet, if we really understand what this is really about, then Kundalini, it's the power behind the transformation. Why? Because Kundalini is consciousness itself. It's just happened that on the level of individual experience, and what gave the term its unique sound, texture, this term, Kundalini. Kundalini is Shakti in its coiled, contracted state, where mythologically, kind of allegorically speaking, it went into a state of slumber, self-imposed state of homeostasis. And in that state of homeostasis, Kundalini experiencing this reality of individual. And in fact, we cannot speak about my or your experience independently from the state of our Kundalini, because our experience is paramount to the degree to the way our Kundalini is either completely asleep, in agitated state prior to awakening, completely awakened, in full process, rising, fully risen, actualized itself, and reposed and repossessed the body. This just in a nutshell, major stages described and talked about in tantric philosophies, in tantric scriptures. So every human being is nothing other than Kundalini in its variety of phases. So therefore, if we read this, when we come across this literature that came from the West, Mercia Eliot, Joseph Campbell, or the aforementioned Carl Jung, for instance. Carl Jung is known for saying that majority of people are fully in a state of slumber. They're not even aware. They do not possess a slightest awareness of any of this, what this represents in terms of how it is spoken in a given tradition which he was made himself busy to study in depth. What he was referring to is almost like this Matrix film analogy, that one is in a complete state of ambios sleep-like. And that's what Kundalini is. So therefore, traditionally speaking, awakening of Kundalini is awakening of consciousness, because Kundalini here is equal to consciousness. And in fact, if we want to go and kind of like have the entrance points of certain traditions, then we will precisely come across these varieties of ways how Kundalini is referred to. Often she is referred to in that way as chitti. Chit is a more masculine way of speaking of consciousness, chit, consciousness. Or chitti is that feminine way of referring to one's consciousness. So Kundalini is often spoken in Tantras as chitti. And there is no human consciousness without Kundalini. So this is therefore the only way to understand Kundalini is to first of all to understand that everything, every attempt to get access to what Kundalini represents in our day and age, in a given culture, will be through the prism of empiricism. So our understanding is already limited there and then, because we still grapple with the term and concept of consciousness. It means so many things for so many people. So therefore Kundalini is, like speaking about Kundalini is even more difficult, because we're dealing here with esoteric concept that was born and developed in a specific culture for millennia. You see? But to dismiss it on the account that well, it's just, kind of something in some culture. To me, it's just a very naive and, quite frankly, uneducated approach. And those who have really delved into this, and certainly those who had some brushes with this power, then they, they know different.
And it seems like there's a lot of conflicting information about it. Like some people, even if they acknowledge Kundalini, they will say that it doesn't really cause, it's not involved in awakening. It's doing its own thing with energy wise. It's not related to an awakening, and it doesn't cause an awakening.
Yes, no, so you're absolutely right. And this in turn is linked and related to, again, to the way this misinterpretation and misunderstanding that the process is spoken. So let us now, maybe it's the first time when we need to really tread gently here, so as not to rush through this with a kind of a blanket response, let alone statement. Because there is a reason why there is this perspective, there is this understanding that Kundalini, speaking of the spiritual process of homecoming or self-actualization, self-realization, is, and I will just give few perspectives of how this process is viewed, from more moderate to more kind of radical, extreme sense of denial. One is that where people acknowledge, right, where there is this acknowledgement, yes, that there is this profound experience of Kundalini, but it's a kind of like not quite clear what is the purpose of that and where it will lead, and whether this at all actually leads to the self-realization, whether it actually delivers, despite all that what New Age so eagerly adopted into its vernacular, right? All these chakra systems, all these psychic centers, and everyone knows this today. So that kind of like it's becoming a commonly held knowledge. So this other perspective where Kundalini is seen as a nuisance, almost like an undesirable experience, almost like a diversion, almost like something that one is better off without. If one wants to progress on the path, leave it alone to those yogis or those who want to manipulate some, forces of nature. This is, we have nothing to do with it. And there is a more radical perspective that Kundalini is, it's just a kind of invention. It's the cultural invention. It doesn't exist. It's it's just some pranic activity, and even the term pranic activity is not used. Some energetic biochemistry. So in other words, it's being dismissed on the account of it belonging to the neurophysiological activity of the body. Usually this radical perspective comes from these ultra echelons of Neo-Advaita, where very little understanding, in fact, on the process altogether. And I've encountered that from my early years when I began to teach publicly and attended conferences where I spoke, and it just baffled me how how some people are completely lost in a gagaland of mental kind of concepts, thinking that this body is just something unrelatable to the whole process. And it took years, literally. I could credit myself for bringing the term body into the Science and Non-Duality Conference as early as 2012. And the term embodiment and the heart well before it was spoken by some of the more well-known teachers years later. Only when this term embodiment began to somehow be introduced, again, in California, in that Bay Area, spilling out from there into other Anglo-Saxon countries, into the Latin country, because that's really where it comes from. Then the picture and the scene began to change. So, but where are these differences come from? Why there is no agreement? Why would there be this discrepancy? And the discrepancy has its analogus in the history, in the culture. So indeed, even within Indian culture, there were many schools of yoga where the awakening of Kundalini force was achieved forcibly. And the Hatha Yoga itself, it's enough to read the key scripture of Hatha Yoga, which is Hatha Yoga Pradipika of Swami Swatmarama, to understand the full degree of that yogic science and what was going on in terms of the approaches and perspectives. It's a very austere, very almost like militant-like, approach, which required a lot of dedication, of course, a lot of that. A lot of this, it's a kind of a warrior path, a lot of sacrifice, self-sacrifices, path fitting the renunciate, because the practice is alone. It's like you'll have a day filled with all the stuff one would need to do just to prepare the body endlessly through series of purificatory rites so as to finally receive that initiation or Shakti path from one spiritual preceptor, and then retreat for a number of years to be given to that process. And there are varieties of ways of how this works. I'm not going to go into this Hatha Yoga Pradipika intricacies, because this is not really what the main idea of what we discuss here. But this gave already a certain, it colored the tradition in a certain way. Whilst at the same time there were other traditions in India, the tradition of Siddhas, of the Maharashtra state, or the Tamil Nadu, the South India, where Kundalini, of course, was this power which was spoken in terms of transmission, mainly through the means of transmission. Therefore, emphasis on the guru, emphasis on the guru shishya, and on that lineage kind of passing, where that tradition, that process of igniting Kundalini, and one has to be a qualified Shaktipat master in order to assist that process. And then it's not so much with the assistance of this severe and very militant-like yogic practices, but more the sadhana of these siddhas is different. They kind of, it's lesser, let's say, in its forcibly used methodologies. It was more kind of rubbing the shoulders or holding hands with the Bhakta movement that swept across India centuries earlier, and that Bhakta movement produced these waves where the very much kind of that access to that energy was given through devotion. So if anyone goes into these studies of this phenomenology of siddhas, these accomplished ones in India, then one would find that they are inseparable from that Bhakta movement of the early poets of India, like Kalidas, Kabir, all these modern bhajans people sing. They all were composed back in the day by, most of them were composed by this, devotional, by nature, men and women. So their approach and work with Kundalini was already different. Then we have this whole body of Brahmins, the whole class of Brahmins. We have this whole kind of scholar, kind of top of the hierarchy of Indian caste system, where Vedic studies is their business, is their job, is their occupation. Where Kundalini is not figured in terms of the term, in the language. The discourses, the recitation and everything is kind of emphasizes different aspects. Not that they did not know about Kundalini. Not that that force was not utilized there. It's just emphasis was made on knowledge, philosophical aspect. And it is that where some of the more modern teachers, like Ramana Maharshi in the 20th century, belong to. Not that he came from that cut. He is a self-taught guru, as we know. He did not have guru of his own. So he was only familiar with maybe a couple of scriptures. We know that Ribhu Gita or Ashtavakra Gita were one of his favorite ones. And that's what most of the modern non-dual teachers will probably have access to and know. Ribhu Gita, probably one of the most known non-dual scriptures that modern day teachers of that so-called lineage know about. So in these scriptures you will not find references to Kundalini. You will not find references to the power of Shakti. So therefore, that already gave us this, divergence of how the power behind the transformation is being viewed and utilized. In other words, in some traditions, it was explicitly clear. And I would like to speak about that in a moment. For instance, in the tantric traditions, of course, Kundalini was the chief deity in practically all tantras. You will not find tantra when there is no Shakti. There is no Shakti, there is no tantra. And so Kundalini Shakti is the chief deity of the process of transformation. It's one's consciousness. It's a transformation of consciousness. So it's seen in esoteric terms and in the actual factual terms verified by countless experiences of the tantrikas of how that process unfolds. So therefore this language is different. And very often that language was dressed in metaphor, appropriate metaphor. In some cases to keep it away from the uninitiated, to keep it away from the people who might taper with these teachings, to keep it safe. It's like working with a very powerful methodology. So tradition will make sure that it doesn't fall into the hands of someone who can hurt themselves or others. It's as simple as that, perhaps. So, putting speculations aside, why exactly, we know that many tantric scriptures were composed in elaborate verse, in often metaphoric verse. And yet there were teachings which were more direct in its expositions, more philosophical. Thus, some of the Shastras of Kashmir Shaivism, right, they speak more directly about these processes without having to conceal them by poetic metaphor. But Kundalini as the goddess is worshipped in all tantras, worshipped and understood to be one and the only power that is capable of bringing about the release from the world of this samskaric kind of imprisonment or the field, where one can rise in that muck, through that muck, through these waters as the symbology of the lotus flower, that though rooted in the mud, it comes as a fully blossoming flower, oozing nectar. So, when we spoke about Kundalini, maybe I should have mentioned that the term itself is with reference to the contracted consciousness. In even the term itself, Kundalini, it's coiled around the lingam 3.5 times, coiled, and spoken of as coiled at the base of the spine, in the subtle body. So, why is it today there is this kind of various perspectives? Well, the picture is twofold, at least twofold. For the simplicity's sake, I would like to give us this, perhaps, how and why it is actually justified, why this power is being marginalized in some ways, in other cases, maybe taken outside of proportion, is because it's very easy to speculate and very easy to fall prey to misconception and misperception when one goes through the process itself. It would require working with an adept to really know the degree of what the process really exemplifies. So therefore, many spiritual teachers, even those who worked with Kundalini, and most probably those who did work with Kundalini, they would be very careful in placing too much emphasis on that what already magnifies everything in the house, because that's what awakening is really very much, or the other side of awakening, the danger side, the kind of like the more sinister side of awakening, that it magnifies everything in the house. But I'm running a little bit ahead of what really you've asked. So going back to this, why some people dismiss it, marginalize it, and others think that this is all there is that because it's very difficult and nearly impossible to have any universally shared perspective where one can agree upon where one is in the process, and because only very few people fully go through that process of Kundalini. This is another thing that is so rarely spoken today, and you can only encounter this when you speak to people who have real understanding of the processes and have access to tradition. So, because of that, a lot of people have some experiences which are like Kundalini or seems like Kundalini. Some people have experiences simply because there is a lot of pranic activity in the body, and draw conclusions based on there are some activity, pranic activity in the body, that one is in the midst of a profound process of spiritual transformation of one's Kundalini. It's way too premature and speculative. So therefore, wise teachers, they work with this cautiously. But dismissing that is another extreme, because there is no transformation of consciousness whatsoever without that what consciousness essentially here represents in terms of its stage of identity with the body and mind. In fact, Kundalini can also be spoken in terms of that portion of Shakti that identifies with personal ahamkara, that principle of individuation. And it is the amount to the degree of the awakening of that power that gives one access to states of consciousness where one factually, viscerally undergoes this growth in consciousness, where one is released from the grips of this identification with body-mind. So therefore, it's a kind of, on one hand, it's a part and parcel of the process. On the other hand, the reason why Kundalini is being such an uneasy topic is because very few people can actually be qualified to speak about this because they completed the journey. And people are in various degrees, on various kind of stages of that process, because the process itself can be so varied. From extremely mild and gradual to violent to intermediate. Violent means traditionally fast and rapid. And when it's fast and rapid, this is where our psyche is under direct assaults, because Kundalini and psyche here is, again, could be used in interchangeable terms. Everything that we have known about ourselves can be fractured in a very short period of time. And yet, if it's not accompanied or if it's not preceded by certain healthy philosophical perspective and psychological maturity, that is capable of giving us very undesirable, unpleasant states where, well, from depersonalization to being thrown into the phase of not knowing whether one is coming or going, where one is, who one is, because that loss of identity here is, though maybe spoken of as desirable from some point of view, because you kind of relax that tight grip. But if it's not accompanied by psychological maturity that requires to hold that process, then the outcome is a kind of mishmash, for a lack of different words, and nothing in terms of what self-realization can be spoken about. So the real work begins, in my books, with the awakening. Everything before that, all my students know that there is a saying we have that before awakening, one is one's teacher. One is one's master. One does as one pleases. It is after or upon awakening, one needs to have a qualitative guidance, because it's very difficult to make sense by doing it DIY style, by going it alone. So this is also why there are such divergent perspectives on role of Kundalini, and certainly if someone professes to teach direct path, and maybe there is this assumption that a direct path presupposes instantaneous realization, and one just gets it, then even that, we could say, has analogy in Shaiva, or speaking from the tradition of Shaivism. It has the analogy that, yes, in that case, one's Kundalini will proceed through a fastest possible route in the very rare scenario of immediate rising. But, if you want to speak about it, I don't know, but this is very rare, exceptionally rare. It's so rare that tradition, as soon as the scriptures speak about it, it immediately adds that it's so rare, there's no point to speak about it.
But I don't think the teacher's path is for everyone. Not everyone is going to find that connection with someone to have that student-teacher relationship. And some of these things have to be navigated by direct experiences. And at some point you have to see through the teacher-student relationship as well.
Can you clarify that? I'm not sure if I understand. Or is it a comment? Or yes, of course. If it's a comment, yes, but as a question.
It was also a question that maybe the teacher-student relationship may not be for everyone, genuinely, not because they are bought into the Neo-Advaita ideas or something, but that may genuinely not be case for some people to find that kind of a relationship.
Yes, of course. We live in time when actually that whole relationship with the teacher or having a teacher has so many different forms. And frankly, majority of people, majority of Western people, and probably today, majority of Eastern people don't want to have teachers. Why do someone want to have a teacher today? People want to have someone who guides them, helps them, do something for them, adds something into their life, you see? Whereas the teacher-student relationship or teacher-student dynamics, speaking in this more kind of in view of how it is understood in wholesome traditions that withstood the test of time, is a very different affair. So today, people may have teachers, and even without even meeting them, or people have teachers without having to necessarily adhere to that what the teacher-student dynamics, ethics, and relationship exemplifies. Likewise, there are people who kind of thoroughly play with these concepts, go into this kind of dynamics to such degree that they lose the understanding of what this is about, because this relationship can very quickly become the reflection of the psychological status of one's psychic maturity. So whatever material is there has not been fully processed will begin to play itself through that projection. So therefore I didn't quite understand first what you meant by that not everybody wants to have a teacher. Yes, of course, I would say yes. I think majority of people don't want to have teachers today, because that's the day and age we live in. But if we are to speak, what are we speaking about here? Yes, you can learn a lot of skills through online YouTube videos. One can learn skills through book, right? We can give so many examples, from martial arts, right, to playing musical instrument, to a real, on a professional level, to learning any of the crafts, anything that will require a passing of sorts of certain something. And yet, certain things will be very difficult to learn alone, or learn with this kind of approach. Again, it may sound repetitive, but if someone thinks that learning is about telling you, you press this chord, use that chord, you have the musical grammar, and you have the kind of, all I know, traditional way of learning of certain classical Indian instruments it's been done in a very traditional way of how spirituality is being taught. And I've heard about these examples from first hand, from those who studied with great masters of Indian classical music. That it was nothing to do with, the master showed me some kind of tricks or some kind of things. It's simply living with the master for 6 months, maybe in this country, very often in that same way of inside in a house, and practicing every single day, whilst master's life going on in its own accord. And that musical master will come once in a while and simply pay attention to what you're doing. And you may sit and kind of like finger your sitar and kind of sarod or whatever instrument you happen to be, you know. You might wait, okay, what's going on now? Am I going to get, no? The master will just stand there, look attentively, and then take the instrument and without saying a word, just play something and give it back to you. And then he will go. Oh, yes, but I mean, what are we speaking about? What are we talking about? You know, I started painting since age of 12 professionally. And I can tell you that you can't learn painting from books. It's a human-to-human contact. It's something that it's learned through not just gesture of what the teacher shows, not even the language. Something else is added into the mix. You remove that something else, and the whole thing is not there. So, do we want to rationalize and turn it into some people want to learn, some people don't want to learn, some people have the capacity? No, of course it's like that. For every 10,000 people, only one person maybe have the capacity to be with the teacher. And from maybe 1,000 of those who have the capacity to be with the teacher, maybe there is 100 who will truly be able to be with the teacher. And out of these 100, maybe only 10 who will truly learn. So, of course, it's a very, very different perspective to Neo-Advaita, where people think that they convert people into a state of Brahman just by reminding them that there is this awareness now, and you are aware right now. And you've been always aware. And you will be always aware. And you will never be closer to your awareness than now. Of course, this is why in kind of that more of a critical perspective, I can see how if non-duality in modern spiritual teaching does not evolve, it sooner or later becomes and takes the form of sermons. And I can see how some very well-known teachers begin to deliver sermons, not unlike religious sermons delivered on Sunday in the church. What's the difference? Tell me the difference. It feels good on that Sunday. You repent, you go home. You feel a little bit lighter, a bit better after the satsang. But that's not real spiritual work, not real spiritual progress. So if some people don't have capacity to be with the teacher, and since this is kind of on a piggyback of what we talked about, Kundalini process, then of course it's up to a person. But the only thing is, you can speak to people who work with these people. I work with these people, but you can speak to other teachers. You can speak to Joanne Harrigan, right? The lady who studied with an Indian master and now recognized as very few of those who can impart the knowledge of the Kundalini Vidya. Or you can speak to someone like Sally Kempton, who was with Muktananda and have gone through the process of spiritual unfoldment herself in her youth. You can speak to someone like Bonnie Greenwell, who is Adyashanti student but went through the full process of Kundalini, and she will tell you that, all these ladies will tell you that it is when one undergoes through the process then the guidance is most needed. When somebody is not in any process, no guidance is needed. Spiritual guidance is more like an entertainment. It's more like a passing of time. But it becomes a matter of almost making or not, making or breaking it. And there are a lot of people out there for whom state of spiritual emergency often turns into a chronic condition instead of union with Brahman. So it's a
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's a complex topic.
Yeah, I think probably one has to go with their own gut and see if that's something that's a calling for them. If they feel a calling to a certain teacher, and maybe there are some who don't feel a genuine calling, so they may have to stick with that. What do you think are the key processes in transformation of consciousness?
Key processes, what do you mean by that? Like key processes in what terms? In terms of?
In terms of self-realization, like what are the key elements, do you think, like what are the key shifts or realizations that happen along the way?
I see. Well, at some point we even have created this kind of, just out of a healthy exercise, a whole delineation of what the process is really and how the process, what the kind of full arch of the process. But here, perhaps I will emphasize on what you even, and you asking that what are the key, right? What are the key phases or aspects? I would say, first, as a prerequisite, perhaps, is a certain existential predisposition. So instead of going straight to what is actually self-realization, but there has to be a kind of a predisposition, that existential situation. It is exemplified by certain realignment of creative forces, or speaking more in that in relation to this energetic bodily processes, is this pranic realignment. So this kind of reaching existential station or existential condition where one has to know the truth. You see? It's, again, that famous canonical encounter of Arjuna with Krishna, right? It begins with that despondency in the chapter 1 of the Bhagavad Gita, where great hero of his time realizes he cannot act. So this, what I call existential predisposition, arises out of that condition where one need to know the truth. So, given that there is this sincere desire to know, because one is inseparable from the other. That tapas, that burning flame, is number one, because without it, everything will be placid. Without it coming, going, it's like, in fact, we could say that nothing can be achieved in life, in any sphere, in any area, without that. One needs to want to have that. So therefore, this existential condition, this predisposition, which comes from anything, it could come from being enough with what one went through, or not enough with having enough. Encountering some experiences which bring no answers and maybe need reconciliation, and reconciliation doesn't come. Again, that creates that predicament, and this is a healthy predicament in terms of spiritual, in that, I would not even hesitate to say that it causes that existential state of agony, that where that predisposition is, I have to know the truth. Like Rumi exclaimed, I need to know, I need to see the face of God. Show me your face, demanding almost, not almost, demanding it. Then the second phase, or second most important, crucial, is that consistency in terms of what one really stands for in all one's being. One needs to have the integrity to follow it through. In other words, that burning desire is not enough. It will need to have this, it needs to be probed by that consistency of effort. That consistency of effort can be exemplified in so many ways. I don't want to go enumerating it, but just that. How it will manifest itself. Maybe for someone it's initiation into a specific practice of meditation, certain maybe ritual, maybe some certain way, it doesn't matter. It could be so many different ways of how it can express itself. Then comes this first encounter with truth. I would say that this is a very important phase where disillusionment is being seen. Disillusionment. And it can happen again. It can be either all of a sudden where things just crumble down and the naked truth is just staring at us in the face. This can be accompanied by collapse of this structure that we have formed and maintained. All that probed by rational way of thinking, and that sort of completely sustained by culture as well. Our participation daily, willingly, unwillingly, consciously or not. So that encounter with truth can be because it's an act of grace. It can be because we stumbled on that. It doesn't matter. And out of that comes this, what then more traditionally spoken in terms of awakening. And awakening here, of course, it's not just a lightly spoken term, it's the entire shift in one's perception. So in other words, if one considered oneself to be so-and-so and living being and this and that, and even though intellectually one understood that this is not so, one actually experiences that. One is in the presence, viscerally, of that shift, and that shift presents itself to whatever degree the utter state of affairs. So this is a very important state. I would say very important phase. Because from there on, the degree and the intent of the intensity is paramount to all that goes into this dedication. Because people can also, like Osho said, when they come to the edge of the cliff, they look down into the abyss and they run back into the forest of samsara. They all talk about, I'm out, I'm out, I'm out, I'm fed up with this. I want to be out of this, I want to know. But when it requires that final jump, leap, then suddenly, no, I want to be back, I want to be, Yeah, it's understandable. It can be quite, not just disorienting and, disheartening, it can be overwhelming. So it's an important phase. Then simply begins the dismantling, because cannot be dismantled in one go. Dismantling of those vikalpas, dismantling of that samskaric field. And this is where a lot of work, this is where the dedication, and this is where sadhana really begins, again speaking from more traditional understanding. Real sadhana is self-initiatory. Before that, we apply effort. Before that, we build up. We're kind of under that existential pressure. But with awakening, often it grants us with that spontaneous, involuntary propensity. Because it's, we are in the process of when everything is being unwinded. And in that unwinding, a lot of stuff comes to the surface, and it's not pleasant. This is where we need to face, and this is borrowing that more of a kind of psychology-based language, where we begin to face all the demons that begin to come out of our cupboards. All this, what has been nicely covered beneath, comes to the surface. And it's a phase of dismantling. So I would say this is an important phase. Then there is an important phase again of the phase of repose and integration. So that we allowed to enjoy this, really enjoy this, because in the dismantling phase it's very difficult to enjoy. We might be thrown into the involuntary states of this or that beatitude or bliss, but there's a lot of laundry as well. So it's not given that the ride is smooth. The ride is more often rough. And in the repose, in that integration phase, there is this possibility to finally savor this. And it's an important phase. And that phase is also very important to begin to rebuild connections with the world consciously. We are not allowed, we can't afford to act from this previous set of unconscious responses or subconscious responses. This is where that razor edge walk begins. And maybe just to kind of give it yet again, very important is the phase of embodiment. Embodiment or return, repossession, embodiment is where even at the level of neurophysiology, our faculties get refined, because this is all-encompassing. So it's not just something happened to consciousness and we are then dealt with the body. That gap would need to be bridged, and the embodiment is that process. Not that we ever disembodied, we always embodied. But here the process of embodiment is that process of return, where, allegorically speaking, the body is purified now. purified. And so consciousness can dwell there in a different way. Not that it will only be roses from now on, but that embodiment also requires a lot of dedication on our part, because very few people can completely the process is so intense that all the sankalpic, not sankalpic, vikalpa, all these psychic impressions are destroyed. Because if that happens, it also could be undesirable. That there is this safety mechanisms at work as well, where the unplugging, speaking the language of neuroscience, when synaptic connections are weakened and completely dissociated and completely unplugged, if it happens to a degree, it's a healthy and good, and we can go through it. If the unplugging is radical and complete, we will be lost in prolonged phases of complete not knowing what the heck is going on and who we are. And that's not desirable. So therefore, gradual unplugging of synaptic connections is more preferable. So therefore, I'm saying very few people, maybe of the status of those like Ramana Maharshi, could afford that. And happened to him at such a young age, even that took a toll on his body. We know that. So after that, certain samskaric impressions, certain psychic impressions will still be there. And vigilance is needed so that they're not taking over, because they can take over gradually. And I've seen that. I've seen that very often, how very beautiful awakening, somehow very beautiful process will somehow, when it reaches that phase of repose and return, will be jeopardized and compromised by giving in to these tendencies which have not outlived, did not die out, you see. Somehow something remained there. Maybe it looked like a husk, but some tentacles, some connections still remained. And in the process of embodiment, if the new qualitative connections were not created, then the old tendencies can be revived and reassert themselves. I hope this is. I hope this makes sense, and
Yeah, that was really descriptive. Thank you for that. That gives a lot of clarity. And can you? I want to be mindful about your time also, but can you also give a glimpse into emergence of that universal consciousness, how that process looks like?
Everything is a dance of subject and object. The dynamics of subject and object and experience, right, exemplified in that unity of observer, observing and observed, right? Seer, seeing and seen. So really that dynamic undergoes refinement. And the universal consciousness is always there, of course. But it's there not fully cognizant. It's always there, of course, in all circumstances. But the dynamics of this trinity somehow acts as a filter which eclipses that. So the return or re-emergence of that unity or universal consciousness is all on the account of the relationship between subject and object. The greater the intimacy of subject and object, the greater one touches to that depth of one's being, which is unity. And subject and object can drown in each other, can have love, relationship, can reflect in each other and illumine each other. They can stand in opposition to each other. There can be a gap, like in witnessing state of consciousness, subject and object in opposition to each other, and therefore it is known as achievement because you have all the required detachment, because you identify with the subject and the world of form and phenomena, in other words, the world of experience becomes a subject. But that witnessing state of consciousness is an intermediate state, though may be spoken of as higher state of consciousness to the mundane reality of experiencing, where that witness, that mindfulness is not there. It's not the full thing. So the refinement of that relationship is what really brings about the experience of universal consciousness. And most people, of course, have the glimpses of that and occasional experiences of that. I give many examples of how this can happen. Especially it happens when one is a spectator, either in a work of art or when one is in beholds magnificent scenery, where the overwhelming spectacle, where senses saturated to such degree by whatever, could be a spectacular landscape, unfoldment, spectacular sunset or sunrise, a seascape, something which is breathtaking. And that breathtaking brings about the collapse of subject and object, even if momentarily. It can happen when one is watching, listening to opera, whether it's a rock opera, the classical opera. It can be when one is contemplating one's favorite work of art, or engaged in a tea ceremony. And just like, it can be in a dance, in a movement, in the act of lovemaking, or maybe even swimming. But these, of course, are fleeting and temporary experiences which do not last. They come and go. Therefore, it's very difficult for us to anchor our awareness in that what was just there and then it's gone. Because this mundane consciousness takes over and subject and object reigns again. You see? So, in a way, we could speak about the job of spiritual maturity or spiritual work is in that appeasing and refinement of relationship between subject and object, where the possibility of them merging becomes at the tip of one's fingers at any time available throughout any experience. When one gains mastery to such degree that one can experience these dynamics without losing that state where subject-object comes and causes that, what could be spoken of as split of union, because that union never undergoes any fracture. It's only spoken from this localized experience. But we cannot speak about it from non-local experience precisely because this is where a lot of theological arguments, if consciousness is localized or this human experience, that subject to various interpretations, divine or profane or dream-like, Maya-like, happen, not happening, this is, again, it's a Tantra, it's a positivistic, Vedanta is, negating this experience, but all boils down to one way or the other is, and all agree that this subjectivity of experience is only available and verifiable through this embodied experience. Through this embodied experience, which at once is localized and yet non-local experience of one's awareness is available at all times, because that's what empowers that what is being experienced as a deeply localized, deeply personal, uniquely individual experience in a given moment in time.
That's very beautifully said, Igor. I was also curious, do you think like some of that merging happens even between the dream state consciousness and waking state consciousness? Like the witness in the dreams, you're more conscious that it's the same witness in the waking state. So that separation that mind creates, that this is a dream and this is a waking reality, even that seems like it starts merging.
Yes, of course, this is why it's spoken very often to when the witnessing begins more or less on a regular basis, this becomes one's reality, then the test is one witnessing that also throughout other relative states. So if one's witnessing only through waking state of consciousness, and yet succumbs, somehow consciousness goes into slumber, in a dreaming and deep sleep, then it means it's not a fully developed, fully mature witnessing, we say. So therefore, that there is a saying, they need to be strung. It's like a needle needs to string all these relative states of consciousness through that witnessing needle of one's awareness. So in other words, one witnesses one's dreams, one witnesses that complete slumber of the deep sleep, when there is no sensory activity and mind is idle and the sense of temporal self is non-existent, simply because all this is absorbed into the causal. So in a deep sleep there is no so-and-so, the individual rests, but the witness remains. Again, we could say that a lot of people have these experiences, occasionally there and then, but they're not substantiative enough to have that stringing-like, uninterrupted-like experience. So therefore, one's consciousness, as it were, still fragmented by these coming and goings of relative states, waking, dreaming, deep sleep. And it is a prerequisite, almost experientially verifiable and need to be lived, when one's consciousness no longer collapses and no longer subjected to the comings and goings of these temporal states, relative states. When that is experienced, it's a very, it's not only beautiful, of course it's beautiful, but it's also this continuation, this continuity is then savored fully. And then it's the subtlest confirmation that one's awareness is not coming and going anywhere. It's not subjected to the brainwave activity. It's seamless and uninterrupted. But even then, it could be so subtle that unless one really understands and really has enough attention, one may not be able to put it together, because people sometimes come up and they complain, well, I cannot sleep at all. My sleep is gone. I'm in the midst of all this. I cannot sleep. It's like this. And of course, at that phase, the connection, the neurophysiological activity is not yet refined enough to experience this simultaneity. Body is at rest and consciousness simply witnessing. And all bodily functions are at rest. No, it's almost like consciousness takes the body and doesn't allow it to rest. It's a very uncomfortable phase. Many people, many meditators know this phase. So, unfortunately, by the way, should not hesitate to bring this reminder. Unfortunately, people resort to tranquilizers and sleeping pills just to ease this discomfort, especially if it's the case of having to do work, like 9 to 5, 9 to 6 jobs, when one is afraid that, family, like you just name it, one needs to function throughout the day. And if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, I haven't slept a wink, I'm gonna go crazy. So this is where guidance is required. This is where guiding someone and reassuring them that this is indeed normal, part and parcel, do not worry. Do this, this and that, take care of yourself, what needs to be done so as to lull the physiology into a comfortable state so that the physiology can, as it were, from that agitated state, learn to rest, whilst consciousness requires no rest. Brahman never sleeps, I say. So, yes.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful thing to experience when your consciousness starts waking up in those states. It's lovely to see something that you have never seen before. And although like some people think that these things are kind of like beliefs, I feel like it's actually it's not a path of belief, it's a path of discovery. In fact, you want to lose all your belief system that you had before. So it's
Absolutely. Because the whole point is that it has to be verifiable directly.
yeah, feedback is important. Otherwise, it's kind of like a belief system.
Yes, and that's also where we've started our conversation, that the highest, like cherry on the cake, right? It's for the one who already has all these experiences, and to make sense of these experiences, or to make greater sense of these experiences, then the Advaitic teaching comes in. This Vedanta gives this philosophical now outlook on what prior to that was experienced deeply personally, without being able to ascertain whether, it's like, where is sky, where is earth, because it's like everything topples over. And this ascertainment comes from the exposure to these teachings. Otherwise, everything very quickly is converted by the mind into ideology. Very quickly converted, right, into the mental systems. And a lot of people out there who partook enough in these satsangs, they think that they got it. In conversations, they think that that's what this is about. And they will argue their way through that this is what this is about. It's about to understand something, and that understanding is the whole point. Whereas, in fact, that conversion into ideology already took place. Mental concept. Before it was mental concept, maybe called ignorance, and we want to get rid of it. Now we replace it with the mental concept of how things are. But they're still concepts.
Yeah, that's
Cognition didn't take place. That root of the term cognition has a Greek gnosis. And gnosis is a Sanskrit jnana. Gyan gave rise to gnosis in ancient Greek. So the English word cognition is something to bring into that knowingness. But it's not a mental concept. It's to cognize. to bring into the gnosis, awakening.
It's very interesting how in the mainstream world we are so deeply cognized with the body mind separate self setup that this, when we talk about this looks like a belief system, whereas actually it's the opposite, where if you are cognized with, if you are that you are something, you are a separate self, everything else, the reality shows up in that, with that cognition, with that level of cognition.
Yes, that's why it's like the verses in the Bhagavad Gita, right? Kind of sound perplexing, but it's for the one who is awake, right? He is asleep when everyone is awake, and he's awake when wait a minute. He's asleep to what everyone is awake, and he is awake to what everyone is asleep. So it's that complete reversal. So this empirical understanding, empirical world we live in right now, right, that transitory phase for human consciousness, where the centuries-old ideologies exemplified via religious truth and revelations no longer serve the requirement of time. And this is where we find ourselves now, on that real frontier, and the precipice where we literally completely exhausted that narrative that we lived. And a new narrative is being born, but we don't know yet. We don't know. We cannot sense it. We cannot define it. So therefore this awakening itself is often pathologized, and in mainstream it doesn't exist. It doesn't even have proper entrance. It's only on the fringes of the culture still remains. Very much on the fringes of the culture. Certainly in the world of psychology and psychiatry, all these terms are still pretty much arguable, controversial, and shrouded in speculation, realities of what human psyche is, what we have accepted as for reality, what we have mistook for reality. So it's an interesting time, very interesting time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting where this goes because with that duality based subject object, I feel like it's kind of like a dead end at some point. You have to be able to pop out of that dualism.
Well, we shall see, definitely, because it's not just duality. It's the picture is. It's really. I mean, I don't want to go into, because it's a completely a theme in its own right, and it's just like kind of. Currently, I brought this into a topic of our online darshans, monthly darshans, what we currently experience in the world, and all this so apparent, with the analogies of these yugas and the laws of the natural law, and how natural law manifests itself, and how in this current day and age, in this Kali Yuga, what are the signs of that laws, of the laws that support and uphold the field of action, the Dharma, the field of action. So it's a violation. We live in time when violation is part of being alive, this violation of these laws. So these laws are violated not just because we somehow got subjected to this subject-object dynamics, because these dynamics are dynamics within consciousness anyway. But it's a progressive loss. This is something which many cultures spoke about, and many cultures, ancient cultures, have this in their in their vernacular. They have that in the myths and in the narratives, that there are these ages, and some ages this harmony is broken down. And why it's broken down, and to what degree it's broken down, and these antagonistic powers that stand facing each other, this power of light and power of darkness, it plays itself out. So this light and darkness are not the subject-object dynamics here. This is something else altogether. And whether this is within the capacity of human consciousness to bring about a qualitatively different world is again a subject of a lot of discussions these days. Are we embedded with consciousness at all to bring qualitative changes? Or, as some willing to interpret this, that we are merely experience this dream, this reality is not really happening, which leaves us almost powerless to anything, you see? Because from that point of view, we have no will of our own whatsoever. So it's an interesting time, this where science is now at, where spirituality is now at, where all this, and of course society is only a reflection of the status of these affairs. Our consciousness expresses itself in a way that we find ourselves in all these myriad of ways of how the world we currently live in is, whether this is health system, or whether this is the international affairs, or whether this is the economical system, and so forth, education.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how things unfold over the next few years. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time, Igor. I just wanted to ask if there was anything you wanted to share, and if I missed anything and you wanted to share it today.
No, I think it was like, the themes that we've touched upon. We can talk, I'm sure, many hours. It's vast areas to explore.
And this was still like an introduction, I think, what we spoke today.
Yes, totally. I totally see this as just unveiling a little corner of this, what is a vast topic to discuss. And as you know, I'm going to be offering a course dedicated entirely to the Kundalini topic, a 3-month course. So, where I hope I will be able to give enough time and insights to deal with all this.
Is it on your website, Igor Kufayev?
Yes, it should be soon, like the landing page and everything. We've already started announcing this. We have the dates, so it will be out.
At some point, I would love to reconnect, and maybe we could go a bit more advanced in some of the pointers we touched upon today, because I feel like there is a lot to unpack in what we kind of like. It was like a encapsulated version.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yes, I'd love to. Let's stay in touch, and when you're ready to tackle, another one, we'll definitely. I'll be up for it.
Thank you. And I also want to quickly thank the viewers If you like this content, please remember to subscribe.